Chapter 11 of the Tocsin of Revolt and Other Essays. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by K. Hand. The Tocsin of Revolt and Other Essays by Brander Matthews. Chapter 11 Cosmopolitan Cookery. 1. Not long ago I chanced to see in a New York newspaper a doleful letter from a British subject temporarily marooned on Manhattan Island, in which he deplored and denounced American cookery. He went so far as to deny us any skill whatever in the art without which men may not live. As I read this perfervid epistle, due it may be to the indigestion provoked by the fried beefsteak in a one-night town hotel, I smiled at the memory of other and equally unrestrained outcries which I had heard from Americans in Paris, protesting that they couldn't get anything fit to eat in the City of Light. These wandering fellow countrymen of mine felt themselves defrauded at being unable to order cornbread and beaten biscuit, codfish balls and buckwheat cakes, when they sat themselves down in the breakfast room of their Parisian hotel. Recalling these Yankee ululations, I understood the Cockney wails, and I wondered what British dainty it was that the straying Londoner had failed to find in New York. Was it veal and ham pie, that substantial, solid, or jugged hare, that unspeakable delicacy? And there came to mind also a recollection of a bitter protest I had once heard from the lips of a Parisian who was spending a miserable fortnight in London, and who was vociferous, beyond the habit of his courteous countrymen, in his denunciation of those twin delights of the English dinner table, the mint sauce with which the British desecrate their otherwise excellent roast lamb, and the bread sauce with which they contaminate their otherwise excellent partridge. This exacerbated Frenchman declared that these two aids to indigestion were indefensible outrages on the gustatory organs and on the alimentary canal. It is difficult not to sympathize more or less with any fellow human being let loose in a foreign land, deprived of the dishes to which he is accustomed, and offended by culinary offerings from which his stomach revolts. Yet it is difficult also not to confess that the woeful complaint of the wandering stranger, be he Briton in the United States, American in France, or Frenchman in the British Isles, is really unreasonable. There is no cosmopolitan standard of right and wrong in gastronomic aesthetics. If jugged hare and veal ham pie, sauce made of mint and sauce mashed out of bread, happen to please the palates of the British, who shall deny them the privilege of compounding these delectable dishes? Caveat emptor, let the foreigner beware. It is for him to guard himself against insidious results to his digestive habits. Every country has the dishes it desires, and the wanderer will do well to experiment cautiously and to be guided thereafter by this experience. None but the brave deserve the fare that will satisfy their appetites. The one wise plan is to pick out of the local dietary the few, or the many, articles which may please, or at least not offend, our own likings, resolutely rejecting all alien dishes offensive to our taste, no matter how volubly these outlandish offerings may be vaunted by their vendors. There is no more obligation upon a Frenchman in Scotland to partake of haggis than there is upon a Scot in Paris to make a meal on frogs' legs. It is wise also to recognize the fact that the cooking of every country has merits of its own, if only we are open-minded enough to perceive them. It is well for the untraveled American in Paris to forego the hope and expectation of a chicken fried in cream, Maryland style, and to risk himself in the exploration of poulet sauté à la Marengo. Probably he will not regret this gastronomic substitution. It is well also for the intrepid English voyager surveying the United States from a car window to overcome his first impression and to taste terrapin, for he may find it not half so nasty as it looks, as the Reverend Mr. Haweis once assured his wife. And even the Gaul, ill at ease in Great Britain, will profit by the willingness to live and learn and by the courage which sustains faith. He may come in time to a keen appreciation of the chump chop, an article of food which is truly insular, since in shape it looks very like a map of England. For the hardy traveler in foreign parts, risking himself in strange restaurants with unknown names on the bill of fare, there is no better motto than "Nothing venture, nothing have." "A difference of taste in jests is a great strain on the affections," said George Eliot, and so is a difference in taste in dishes. Tell me what a man laughs at, and I will tell you what he is. Tell me also what he eats, and I can at least make a guess as to what manner of man he is. Perhaps there is here a suggestion for the League of Nations, and one clause of the covenant might assert the right of every country to exercise self determination in all matters of cookery. The signers of this treaty of peace must remember that as French is still the language of diplomacy, so also is the cookery of France still the standard by which that of other countries is measured. And the friendly foreigners invading Paris will do well to try modestly to discover the reason why the culinary artists of France are justly entitled chefs. 2. In his most suggestive discussion of food and feeding, the late Sir Henry Thompson, the distinguished surgeon of London, celebrated also for his octaves, as he called his little dinners of 8, pointed out clearly the essential difference between the racial cookery of the French and that of the English. The British Isles have a damp climate with frequent rain, resulting in luxuriant grass, which provides an ideal provender for cattle. So it is that in England beef and mutton are likely to be the best of their kind, and therefore the British cook's sole duty is to present these meats unadorned, so that the full flavor of the flesh may be preserved. This is to say that the proper effort of the British artist in the kitchen is directed toward the stark simplicity which gives us plain roast beef and plain roast lamb, the naked beef steak and the unclothed mutton chop, the bare pheasant and the bare haunch of venison, each of them sufficient unto itself and not needing any auxiliary sauce. British cookery at its best is beauty unadorned. France is less rainy, and the breeding of cattle has not been so careful there as it has been in England, with the result that beef and mutton are likely to be somewhat inferior, and therefore it is the prime duty of the French artist in the kitchen to stimulate the appetite and help it to be satisfied with meats which may be a little tough and even stringy. What is true of beef and mutton is also true of fish. Paris is 3 or 4 hours from the sea, and the fish does not always arrive there in the most perfect condition, and therefore their cook is tempted to disguise a possible lack of freshness by the piquancy of his sauces. London, on the other hand, is in fact what the American schoolgirl declared it to be in her geography examination. London is the capital of a small island off the coast of France. Because it is the capital of a small island set in a silver sea, London gets its fish in the best possible condition, and therefore it is the duty of the English cook to present fish with the inexorable simplicity with which she presents beef and mutton. Woe betide her if she venture upon any alien sauce. That way madness lies. It is the old antithesis between art and nature. The British cook is excellent when she lets well enough alone, and the French cook is wise in his generation when he makes the best of the material at his disposition. There are 69 ways of writing tribal lays, and every single one of them is right. The best trained palate will find it difficult to declare which is the more truly satisfactory: the simple fried sole which one can count upon anywhere and everywhere in England, and the more complicated sole marguerie or sole mornay, final rewards of a visit to Paris. So it is impossible to accord precedence either to the roast beef of old England or to the filet Chateaubriand of France, when this latter dish is truly what it pretends to be. That is to say, when a thick tenderloin has been broiled between 2 slices of inferior beef, thus retaining all its own juice, even absorbing that of its twin coverings. In France, cookery, like millinery, is one of the fine arts, and art is long. Complaint is made in Paris that the culinary art is falling from the high estate to which it had attained in the 19th century. For this decadence, if decadence there be, we are supplied with 2 reasons. First, because the cooks themselves are in a hurry to reap the reward of the artist, and are not now willing to serve the long and arduous apprenticeship which is the only road to a complete mastery of the mysteries of the craft. And second, because the public is also in a hurry, indisposed to order in advance and so to allow the full time necessary for the preparation of a gastronomic masterpiece. Of course, the foreigners who flock to Paris to get their fill of aesthetic sensations are the worst offenders, But even the Parisians themselves are unreasonable in speeding up the artist, and in thus compelling him to improvise, as it were, to risk a hit or miss effect, instead of achieving the flawless execution of a premeditated and perfectly combined bill of fare. French cookery also suffers in another way from the invasion of the barbarians. It is in Paris that the culinary art has attained to its culmination and achieved the apex of its glory. It is only in Paris that the student of high aspiration and of ample inspiration can acquire its ultimate secrets. But we all know that there are now abroad in the world a host of French cooks, falsely so called, who have never studied in the French capital and who are not even French. Being therefore devoid of the innate gift of the Gaul, these outlanders, if we may so term them, these intruders into the temple, are likely to lack both the native endowment and the solid instruction without which there is only vanity and vexation of spirit. They may on occasion cling to the letter of the law, but they are wanting in understanding of its soul. 3. I have sought to show that if the Parisian despises the cookery of the Londoner, it is because he has failed to appreciate its peculiar excellence, that is to say, its simplicity. And it would not be more difficult to explain that the Englishman is in error when he condemns the cookery of the American. There is bad cooking aplenty in the United States, as there is also in Great Britain, often due to an ignorant effort to imitate the imitable art of the French. But just as English cooking is good when it conforms to its own traditions, so American cookery can be excellent in its own way. Is the bouillabaisse of Marseilles really more alluring than the clam chowder of Cape Cod? Of course, if the French and British travelers in the United States expect to get their own special culinary successes, they are foredoomed to disappointment. We cannot set before them either fried sole or sole mornay, because the unkind fate has deprived us of the sole itself. But we can proffer them the planked shad, and what better dish can there be? We may go further and ask if any venturesome alien has really the right to look down on one of the humblest of our dishes, corned beef hash, when it has been compounded by competent hands? And who shall decry the equally humble codfish ball when its flattened globe is the work of a born cook? It is our misfortune now that we can no longer rest our case on the canvas back duck of sainted memory, departed and deeply mourned, and so nearly forgotten, that the tale is told of a Londoner, at his first dinner in a New York hotel, asking for the celebrated canvas back clam. I doubt if anyone has yet done justice to the variety and to the merit of our sweet dishes. Has any other country in the world anything to compare with the strawberry shortcake, when it is truly shortcake and not sponge cake, when it is deluged with real cream and not desecrated with whipping cream? And consider for a moment that invention of the Puritans and the Pilgrim Fathers, baked Indian pudding, with its indigenous flavor enhanced by hard sauce. The Pilgrim Mother who originated that abiding delight deserves a monument more enduring than brass, and yet, sad to relate, this truly American invention is unknown to the benighted Britons. That is, if we may believe the possibly apocryphal tale of the English lady who protested when she first heard of this dish, "Baked Indian! How horrible! I knew you Americans were savages, but I didn't suspect that you were cannibals." Then there are our pies, unhonored and unsung, except by Eugene Field, who once rhymed a lilting lyric in praise of apple pie and cheese. Full many a sinful notion, conceived of foreign powers, has come across the ocean to harm this land of ours. And heresies called fashions have modestly effaced, and baleful, morbid passions corrupt our native taste. O tempora, O mores, what profanations these, that seek to dim the glories of apple pie and cheese. The American apple pie is not the British apple tart. Far from it. In fact, the British apple tart is closely akin to what we know as the deep dish apple pie. Nor is the American apple pie at all like the French tourte aux pommes, which is a thin circular disk with a raised rim and no upper crust. The American lemon meringue pie has been degraded and disgraced by base and fraudulent imitations, seemingly concocted out of glue and soap suds and shoe leather. But when it has been created by an inspired ebony artist with kinky curls bound up in a bandana, it is indeed a good creature. And there is pumpkin pie, scorned by the highbrow, but none the less welcome when it is also due to the deft touch of a sable craftswoman. A friend of mine, long deprived of this delicacy, dear to his New England boyhood, recently saw it upon the bill of fare of one of the fashionable hotels of New York, and he was about to order it when he hesitated, in doubt whether its adequate preparations was a possible feat for the presumably French pastry cook of that sumptuous hostelry. He was promptly reassured by the head waiter: "We have an American to make our pumpkin pies, and what's more, he's a coon." I confess that I wish I knew which pie it was, pumpkin or apple, lemon meringue or mince, that Emerson ordered on his trip to California, evoking from a young lady in the party the surprised question, "Why, Mr. Emerson, do you eat pie?" To which the benignant philosopher is recorded to have responded, "My dear young lady, what is pie for?" We do not often pause to recall the variety of the foodstuffs unknown to Europe until after Columbus had returned from his venturesome voyage across the Western Ocean. There is tobacco, if that can be called a foodstuff, which may be doubtful. No European or Asiatic or African could smoke until the Nicotian weed had been acclimated. There is the sugar cane. No Greek and Roman could put sugar in his beverages until after a method had been discovered for making it out of the juice of the cane. And the Roman and the Greek could enjoy only such sweet dishes as might be sweetened by honey. Even to this day maple sugar is almost unknown in Europe; indeed it is so little known that Thackeray, in the first edition of the Virginians, did not hesitate to describe it as being garnered in the autumn. There is the tomato also, and the potato, and the turkey, falsely believed to have come from the country from which it borrowed its name. There is maize, which we call Indian corn, and which is our most important food crop, more important even than wheat. It is used by the English only rarely, under the name of corn flour, and it is so unfamiliar to the Irish that when cargoes of it were sent over from America during the famine, the peasants died because they did not know how to make bread from what they termed yellow meal. Only in Italy has Indian corn been made as useful as in its native land. Apparently the Italians never learnt how to prepare corn bread, but one of the most popular dishes of the peasantry is polenta, which is their equivalent of our hasty pudding. When Joel Barlow was wandering around Europe a century ago, he recognized our homely American dish, and he sang its praises in his unpretending poem, "The Hasty Pudding," which lingers now in many a memory ignorant of its ambitious epic, the Columbiad. The sweets of hasty pudding, come, dear bowl, guide o'er my palate and inspire my soul. The milk beside thee, smoking from the kine, its substance mingle, married in with thine, shall cool and temper the superior heat, and save the pains of blowing while I eat. But man, more fickle, the bold license claims In different realms to give thee different names. Thee the soft nations round the warm Levant Polenta call, the French of course polente. E'en in thy native regions now I blush To hear the Pennsylvanians call thee mush. On Hudson's banks, where men of Belgic spawn, Insult and eat thee by the name Sapon. All spurious appellations, void of truth, I've better known thee from my earliest youth. Thy name is Hasty Pudding, thus my sire Was wont to greet thee, fuming from his fire. 4. Christmas cheer comes once a year, so the old saying asserted. But will it come even once now that we are in the fell clutch of prohibition? Will Christmas be as cheerful as it used to be, when the mince pie lacks its full flavor, and when the blue flame will never again flicker about the base of the plum pudding? If our island ancestors had voted England dry a century ago, Washington Irving could never have written his appetizing account of the Christmas dinner, and Charles Dickens would not have been able to take the hint from his American predecessor, and to interlard his bold and broad narratives with incessant descriptions of eating and drinking. How many hearty feasts Dickens set before his readers with unfailing gusto. Dr. Holmes declared that we could gauge the rate of respiration of the poets by noting the meters they severally preferred, the writers of octosyllabic verse being swifter breathers than their brethren who chose the stately and straight-backed pentameter. Perhaps we can guess at the relative digestive apparatus of the novelists by the frequency with which they deal with foods and feeding. Who can doubt that Dickens had a stout stomach, and that he was a trencherman to be compared only with Rabelais? And Thackeray was the author of Memorials of Gormandizing. The records of repasts we find in many an English novel make our mouths water, and even the poets have left us carols of cookery and recipes in rhyme, of which latter the most famous is Sydney Smith's recipe for a salad, with a sublime assurance in its final quatrain: "Then though green turtle fail, though venison's tough, And ham and turkey are not boiled enough, Serenely full the epicure may say, 'Fate cannot harm me, I have dined to day.'" Yet we cannot disguise the fact that there is monotony in the menu, that our meals lack variety whatever the skill of our cooks, that we are confined to the flesh of bipeds and of quadrupeds, except when we prefer the footless fish. A new dish is as great a variety as a new sin. There are now no new worlds for the gastronomic traveler to explore. We do not crave the blubber dear to the dwellers near the North Pole, nor can darkest Africa provide us with the baked elephant's foot, which I have longed to taste ever since my early boyhood, when I read about it in Ballantyne's Gorilla Hunters. And in those same youthful years I wanted a slice of buffalo hump, a delicacy now impossible of attainment, although it was an everyday dish for the heroes of Edward S. Ellis's dime novels, which delighted the hearts of the lads of my time. Here in America we have lost the canvas back duck, and we have never had the sole. We may read about them, we may peruse the text books which prescribe the proper methods of cooking them, but we cannot hope to feed on them. Still there is comfort of a kind in the cook books themselves. Age cannot stale them, nor custom wither their infinite variety. There was a picture in Punch long, long ago, which showed us a Lady Bountiful visiting one of her pensioners, and asking if this dilapidated old woman had read a cook book which had been bestowed upon her. And to this question the pensioner responded, "Yes, my lady, I read it, but I'd rather have had the ingrediments." In default of the ingredients, we must seek solace in the cook book itself, not so nourishing as it may be, yet awakening delectable memories. She was a sensible person, that impoverished gentlewoman, who had trained herself to find satisfaction in sipping her tea and munching her toast, while she gave a loose to her imagination by reading the recipes out of the most expensive dishes, as amply written out by a former chief of the kitchen of Her Majesty Queen of England and Empress of India. 1919. End of chapter 11.
Chapter 12 of The Tocsin of Revolt and Other Essays. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Beth Thomas. The Tocsin of Revolt and Other Essays by Branda Matthews. Chapter 12. On Working Too Much and Working Too Fast. I have recently read an article in which it was asserted that American fiction is in a parlous state because our storytellers write too much and write too fast, and I am moved to file a protest. I dispute the assertion, and I decry the validity of the reasons advanced in support of it. First of all, we need to remember always that contemporary criticism about contemporary literature is very rarely important or significant. We cannot see the forest for the trees. We lack the perspective of time. We are unable to anticipate the ultimate result of the slow but sure process of selection which separates the chaff from the wheat, and which results in casting aside a host of writers often of a salient prominence in the eyes of their immediate contemporaries. We may, every one of us, have our individual opinion as to the probable permanence of present-day reputations, but we can, no one of us, feel any certainty that this individual opinion is going to be justified by the communal decision of the next generation. The writers whom we acclaim loudly may be lost to sight beneath the wave of oblivion half a century from now, and the writers to whom we do not deign to give a thought may then have proved themselves to be possessed of the one thing necessary for survival. Robinson Crusoe and Pilgrim's Progress won instant popularity, yet they were altogether ignored by the self-appointed dispensers of critical approval. Sir Philip Sidney thought that the English drama was beneath contempt, and it was just about to flower out exuberantly. Guy Patin thought that the French drama was in a very lamentable condition, and it had just been illumined by the masterpieces of Corneille, Molière, and Racine. In the late Professor Lounsbury's posthumous history of the life and times of Tennyson, there is this quotation from Macaulay's diary under the date of March 9, 1850. "It is odd that the last 25 years, which have witnessed the greatest progress ever made in physical science, the greatest victories ever achieved by mind over matter, should have produced hardly a volume that will be remembered in 1900. And Lounsbury follows this with another quotation from a letter of Macaulay's written a few months later, in which the writer declared that Sir Henry Taylor's Philip van Artevelde is still, in my opinion, the best poem that the last 30 years have produced. Then Professor Lounsbury asked, could a more suggestive illustration be furnished of the worthlessness of contemporary criticism of the productions of the imagination? The quarter of a century, whose intellectual poverty was so strongly pointed out by Macaulay, had witnessed the production of much of the best work of both Tennyson and Browning in poetry, of Dickens and Thackeray and Carlyle in prose, not to speak of no small number of writers like Bulwer, Disraeli, Kingsley, and others who still continue to be remembered and read. When men of the acumen and authority of Sidney, Guy Patin, and Macaulay have thus revealed their inability to see what was before their eyes, modesty suggests that those of us who are less amply endowed with vision should be cautious in expressing confidence in our own insight in regard to our immediate contemporaries. Especially ought we to be careful not to let our keen perception of the manifest and manifold defects in the average novel blind us to the probability that there are also not a few novels above the average and free from the more glaring of these deficiencies. There is no need to deny that the average American novel of today is a poor thing. So is the average British novel. So is the average French novel. And so was the average British and American and French novel of the last generation and of the generation before last. The immense majority of contemporary novels in any language and in any epoch are for immediate consumption only. They serve their temporary purpose, well or ill, and then they are forgotten, as their places are taken by other novels, no better and no worse. It is quite possible that at the present moment American fiction is in the trough of the waves, and that we do not happen to possess just now any writer of fiction whose work will be cherished 50 years hence. And, on the other hand, it is also possible, indeed it is highly probable, that more than one of the novels produced here in the United States in the first 15 years of this 20th century will emerge triumphant from out of the watery waste of the average novel of this decade and a half. But whether or not our storytellers are as unsatisfactory as was alleged in the article I had read, there is no reason for accepting the explanation that their failure is due to undue haste and to undue productivity. Underlying this explanation is the unexpressed conviction that the best work is possible only to those who labour slowly and to those who do not produce abundantly. This is an opinion cherished by many critics who find justification for their faith in the fact that the most prolific authors are frequently also the most slovenly in style and the most happy-go-lucky in structure. No doubt there are many works of fiction which would be better than they are if the author had taken more pains, and he might have taken more pains if he had taken more time. Yet the more familiar we are with the history of literature and with the biography of authors, the less inclined we are to accept this view unreservedly. It is true that time is jealous and is likely to destroy that which is done with his aid. It is true also that there is today, as always, a superabundance of hasty work turned out by writers who are rushing through the story they have in hand so that they can start as soon as possible on the story that they have in mind. But it is not true that all the masters have written slowly, and that they have produced only after a long and laborious gestation. Whatever categorical dogmatism may say to the contrary, it is a matter of common knowledge that fecundity of production and swiftness of execution are often characteristics of genius, and even of talent. Ben Jonson boasted that he had given 2 years to a single play, and 2 years was also the time which Ibsen devoted to each of his later social dramas. But Jonson and Ibsen, important as they are, do not rank with the supreme masters of the drama, Sophocles, Shakespeare, and Molière. The dramatic activity of Sophocles extended over 62 years, so the late Professor Butcher recorded, and the greatest of Greek dramatists is believed to have composed 113 plays, very nearly 2 a year, a productivity 4 times that of Ibsen and Johnson. The dramatic activity of Shakespeare extended over 20 years, and he wrote 39 or 40 plays, again about 2 a year. The dramatic activity of Molière extended over 15 years, and he wrote about 30 plays, once more about 2 a year. The only deduction from these figures is obvious enough. Ben Jonson and Ibsen were right in taking 2 years to a play, because by so doing they were able to put forth their utmost strength. And Sophocles, Shakespeare, and Molière were also right in turning out 2 plays a year, because by so doing they were able to reveal more amply their more copious fecundity and their swifter certainty of execution. The most popular play of the younger Dumas, the Dame aux Camélias, was dramatised from his own story in a single week, and the most popular play of Victor Hugo, Hernani, with its sonorous and resplendent verse, was actually written, it had been previously plotted in a complete scenario, in exactly 4 weeks. Would either of these plays have been any better if it had cost its author the protracted labour of 2 years? It is current gossip that a prominent British novelist of our day wrote her stories 7 times before she was satisfied to let them leave her hands. She might rewrite them 70 times 7 without breathing the breath of life into her graven images. And the suggestion may be ventured that if she had dared to publish the first draft of any one of her devitalised revisions, perhaps it might have been found to disclose a spontaneity sadly lacking in her novels as we have been permitted to peruse them. The writer of the article I had read soars into a dithyrambic rhapsody over the 30 years which Flaubert gave to Madame Bovary, and there is no denying that Madame Bovary is one of the many masterpieces of the art of fiction. But it is a masterpiece not solely or even chiefly because of its finish and its polish. No masterpiece has ever been achieved by the external accessories of finish and polish. Books cannot live by style alone. Madame Bovary is great primarily because of its content, of its author's inquest upon human nature, of his insight into character. Moreover, when all is said, Madame Bovary is not easy reading in the sense that Vanity Fair, The Scarlet Letter, and The Rise of Silas Lapham are easy reading. It is a painful pleasure we take in its perusal, and the joyless toil that went to its making oppresses the reader, forced to share the sore travail of the author. Every artist must obey the law of his own being. He can do his best only in accordance with the self-imposed restrictions which he has found to be most helpful. Only by infinite toil could Flaubert achieve the austere simplicity of Madame Bovary, and therefore he was compelled to infinite toil. Because this meticulous method suited him, he sought to impose it upon Maupassant, to whose exuberant temperament it was entirely uncongenial. What the pupil retained from the master's teaching was an abiding respect for the art of construction and for the art of writing. The personal method of the master the pupil rejected, fortunately for himself and for his readers. I have read somewhere that Maupassant once came downstairs to a midday breakfast with a smile of satisfaction on his face, and said to his mother that he had just made 300 francs, explaining that he had written the short story The Necklace. Now, in its own way, La Parure is as undeniably a masterpiece as Madame Bovary itself. Mr. Rudyard Kipling once told me that his amusing narrative of midnight misadventure, Brugglesmith, had been conceived, composed, and completed on the evening of the day when he had heard from Mr. Oliver Herford the anecdote which suggested it. And Mr. Irwin Lefebvre informs me that he composed Woman and Her Bonds at a single sitting and before breakfast. Now, Woman and Her Bonds is the best of its author's Wall Street stories. It is one of the best of American short stories, ingenious in invention, adroit in construction, swift in movement, and clear in style. It would be easy to heap up illustrations from the other arts to show that speed is not necessarily a danger. Mr. Sargent painted Carnation, Lily, Lily Rose in one long English twilight, and then scraped it off the next morning, only to paint it again that afternoon and to remove it the following day, until after half a dozen sighting shots he hit the bull's-eye and rested content with the result of the final evening's work. The Barber of Seville, which has survived now for exactly a century, was composed and produced in less than a month, after Rossini had composed and produced in the preceding month an opera which was an immediate and total failure. Verdi wrote Rigoletto in 6 weeks, and Schubert wrote his song The Earl König in 1 afternoon. But there is no need to multiply illustrations. Fecundity and celerity of execution may be elements of strength. Many men of genius have produced abundantly, incessantly, and swiftly. On the other hand, it does not follow that a man who produces abundantly, incessantly, and swiftly is necessarily a man of genius. There are now, there have always been, and there always will be, men who write too fast and who write too much, because they are writing chiefly with the desire to make money. These men write themselves out, and they write themselves down, and there is no need to waste words over what they write, or to reprove them for what they do and for how they do it. They are beneath criticism, not because they write too much and too fast, or chiefly for money, but because they are what they are. Their failure is not due to a defective method, it is due to a deficient character. After all, there are 69 ways of writing tribal lays, and every single one of them is right. Balzac drafted and amplified and amended and was forever revising his proofs, and so best, since that was the process most profitable to him. Scott wrote at white heat, not knowing when he began where he was going to end. And so best again, since he was an improviser of genius, incapable of inexorable self-criticism. Either of these great novelists would have been wrong if he had tried to compel himself to work in accord with the method of the other. So long as the barrel is full, it does not matter whether the water is allowed to drip drop by drop from the spigot, or whether it is permitted to gush generously from the bunghole. And so long as the barrel is able to replenish itself unceasingly from the spring, it does not matter how frequently the water is drawn off. End of chapter 12.
Chapter 13 of The Tocsin of Revolt and Other Essays. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sonia. The Tocsin of Revolt and Other Essays by Brenda Matthews. Chapter 13. The Modernity of Molière. This address was delivered in April 1922 at a meeting of the American Academy of Arts and Letters, commemorating the 300th anniversary of the work of Molière and honored by the presence of 2 representatives of the Académie Française. Monsieur Donnet and Monsieur Chevrillon have come 3,000 miles to take part in our tribute to the genius of a man who was born 300 years ago. Our invitation and their crossing of the Atlantic bear witness to the fact that the fame of Molière is both enduring and world-wide. No one of the makers of French literature is more typically, more fundamentally French than he, and yet here, in a city almost unknown and absolutely unimportant 3 centuries ago, we are today assembled to do him honor, and to acclaim him as the master of modern comedy. He was not only a man of his own country, he was a man of his own time. In the early years of the long reign of Louis XIV, he came a little later than Corneille and a little earlier than Racine, and neither of them is as representative of that glittering epoch as Molière. And yet half a dozen or half a score of his 30 plays are alive today in all the freshness of their eternal youth. He is not for his own country alone, but for all civilization, and he was not for his own age only, but for ours also. To say this is to say that he possesses the 2 indispensable qualities of a classic. His masterpieces have a large measure of permanence and a large measure of universality. I have studied him lovingly for half a century, and as I came to a more intimate acquaintance with his writings and to a keener appreciation of the man himself, I felt more and more the modernness of his work. No doubt it bears unmistakably the impress of his own time. All masterpieces do that, of course, those of Sophocles and Shakespeare no less than those of Molière. Yet he is more modern than the great Greek tragedian who lived 2,000 years ago, and more modern even than the great Englishman who wrote both comedies and tragedies, and who died only 6 years before the great Frenchman was born. the great Spaniard Calderon survived Molière 8 years, and his plays seem to us almost archaic in their stagecraft and in their spirit, whereas the comedies of Molière are modern both in their form and in their content. The modernity of his form is obvious enough, and he is the master of modern comedy not only because he realized better than any predecessor in any country what the true province of comedy was, and what were its possibilities and its limitations, but also because he wrote for the modern playhouse, with its roof, with its artificial lighting, with its scenery, with its seated spectators. The pattern he devised for this modern playhouse is the pattern employed by the playwrights of every European language, even though they may be totally unaware of the debt they owe to him. Shakespeare's plays have to be modified to adjust themselves to our theatres. Molière's do not demand any rearrangement, not a single transposition, nor a single omission. Sheridan could not have plotted The School for Scandal if Molière had not plotted The Misanthrope and The Femme Savante. Ibsen could not have put together The League of Youth and The Pillars of Society if Molière had not devised Tartuffe. He had profited by his early study of Plautus and Terence, as they had profited by their study of Menander, but the Greek and the two Latins in their turn had progressed only to the play of intrigue, the comedy of anecdote. They were not equipped to achieve the comedy of manners, the comedy of character, the social drama, the play which, while it makes us laugh, also makes us think. Their field was narrowly restricted, and the hampering conditions of the social organization in Athens and in Rome did not tempt them, indeed did not permit them, to achieve a large and liberal treatment of human nature. Shakespeare, as it happened, never undertook the comedy of manners which is also a comedy of character, perhaps because his social background did not supply the material for this special type of comedy. The London of the Virgin Queen lacked the urbanity of the Paris of the Grand Monarch. Elizabethan society was boisterous in speech and violent in temper, and therefore no one of Shakespeare's ever delightful comedies, sometimes delicately romantic and sometimes robustly farcical, is a picture of the life of his own time and of his own country. Molière in 4 or 6 of his amplest and deepest comedies brings before us his own contemporaries, as he had observed them in the city of his birth. It was these contemporaries that Molière had to please, if he was to keep his theatre open, and this is what every great dramatist has had to do, Sophocles no less than Shakespeare. We can see that Molière took account of what was wanted by the Parisians of the second half of the 17th century, by the young king, by the burghers, and by the populace also. He gave them what they expected from him, and also more than they expected, sometimes even more than they were ready to receive. Leading his audiences upward, coaxing them along, skillfully stimulating their desires, he was able at last to rise to a level to which no earlier comic dramatist had aspired. Great dramatists have always been popular in their own day. True it is that they may not have been adequately appreciated while they were alive, but they were successful none the less. I doubt whether even Ben Jonson, with all his friendship for Shakespeare, was really aware of his friend's true greatness, and I fear that of all Molière's associates, only Boileau and La Fontaine were keen-eyed enough to measure his superiority. But there is no denying that Shakespeare and Molière were popular favorites, and that the playgoers flocked gladly to see their plays performed. This immediate popularity of theirs was due in a measure to their skill in hitting the taste and in satisfying the likings of their contemporaries, although of course their permanent fame could be assured only by their major merits, by their power of creating characters which are eternally attractive because they are eternally veracious. Molière did not hesitate to amuse his audiences with satire of passing fads and follies, with things strictly contemporary, with things absolutely up to date. Now, it is the disadvantage of the contemporary that it is 4 parts temporary, as it is the disadvantage of the up to date that it is swiftly out of date. It is a striking testimony to Moliere's genius that his satire of the whims and oddities of his own period has its lesson for us in another century and in another country. What was fleeting and momentary is only on the surface, and beneath it we can discover a veracity as abiding as human folly is perennial. The fashion has altered, and not a little, but the stuff is the same, since it is woven from the unfailing absurdity of human nature. The affectations that Molière held up to scorn in the Précieuses Ridicules in France are not unlike those which we laugh at today in America, in the Culture Club of Keokuk, Iowa, for example, and in other clubs not so far from Manhattan Island. The learned ladies, the femmes savantes, of Manhattan Island are not now cultivating the garden of Greek roots. They are digging up the roots of society. They are parlor anarchists. They are little groups of serious thinkers who pride themselves on being open-minded, not having discovered the inconvenience of a mind open at both ends. The imaginary invalid today is a morbid student of psychoanalysis, making a collection of his own fraudulent complexes. And Tartuffe? Well, our Tartuffes do not masquerade as religious bigots, rather are they moral reformers, damning the sins they have no mind to, reformers for revenue only, as dangerous to the public welfare today as was Tartuffe in his time. What is Scapin but a proof before letters of the chief figure in our crook plays? What is the unscrupulous valet who befools Monsieur de Pourceaugnac but the first edition of our confidence operator, our bunco steerer, if I may venture to employ these unsavory neologisms in the presence of two members of the French Academy? My sole excuse for this lapse from linguistic propriety is my wish to emphasize the fact that Molière is our contemporary, after all, that he is quite up to date 2 centuries and a half since he died. Molière is important to us here in America, not only because of the pleasure and the profit we can find in the performance of his plays and in their perusal, if we are denied the benefit of seeing them acted. He is important to us not only because he is the master of modern comedy, but also because he is the chief figure in French literature, because he united in himself certain of the chief characteristics of that literature, its dramatic ingenuity and its abhorrence of affectation, its relish for the concrete and its social instinct. It is good for us to see these characteristics in action, and the lesson Molière has for us transcends the limitations of literature. While there may be a more soaring imagination, a more easily released energy, in English literature in both its branches, British and American, than there is in French literature, there is a far less persistent application of the reasoning powers, a less free play of the intelligence, less sobriety and less sanity, more exuberance and more extravagance. The French inherited from the classics a sense of form, a desire for unity of tone, for harmony of color, for logic in structure and for lucidity in style. If Carlyle and Ruskin and Whitman had sat at the feet of the masters of French literature, they would have been less impatient of authority, less flagrantly individualistic, less rhetorically riotous. Though they might have lost a little, they would have gained much. Nisard knew his countrymen when he asserted that in France reason, which is the common bond of all men, is more highly esteemed than imagination, which disperses them and isolates them. We have gathered here today to listen to the addresses of our 2 guests from across the sea, and to pay tribute to a great Frenchman. And we have also a larger purpose, to testify to our appreciation of French literature as a whole, and to our admiration and affection for the French people. Here in America we are not likely ever to forget the indebtedness we are under to France for coming to our rescue in our hour of need nearly a century and a half ago. That debt is a debt of honor, and it is not outlawed by time. Nor can we fail to remember that it was a Frenchman, Rousseau, who inspired the superb eloquence of the Declaration of Independence, and that it was another Frenchman, Montesquieu, whose political sagacity guided the makers of our Constitution. The tie that binds us to France is twisted of many strands of many colors, but we have reason to believe that it is strong enough to withstand any strain that may be put upon it. 1922. End of chapter 13.
Chapter 14 of the Tocsin of Revolt and Other Essays. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by K. Hand. The Tocsin of Revolt and Other Essays by Brander Matthews. Chapter 14. Theodore Roosevelt as a Man of Letters. 1. The more closely we scrutinize Theodore Roosevelt's life, and the more carefully we consider his many ventures in many totally different fields of human activity, the less likely we are to challenge the assertion that his was the most interesting career ever vouchsafed to any American, more interesting even than Benjamin Franklin's, fuller, richer, and more varied. Like Franklin, Roosevelt enjoyed life intensely. He was frank in declaring that he had been happy beyond the common lot of man, and we cannot doubt that Franklin had the same feeling. The most obvious cause of the happiness and of the interest of their contrasting careers is that they had each of them an incessant and insatiable curiosity, which kept forcing them to push their inquiries into a variety of subjects wholly unrelated one to another. The many-sided Franklin was the title which Paul Leicester Ford gave to his biography, and Roosevelt was even more polygonal. Like Franklin again, Roosevelt will hold a secure place among our statesmen, our men of science, and our men of letters, demanding due appraisal by experts in statecraft, in natural history, and in literature. But they differ in this, that Roosevelt was an author by profession, and Franklin was an author by accident. Roosevelt had looked forward to literature as a calling, whereas Franklin produced literature only as a byproduct. Excepting Poor Richard's Almanac, Franklin never composed anything in the hope or desire for fame or for money, or even in response to a need for self-expression. He never published a book, and if he could return to earth he would indubitably be surprised to discover that he held an important place in the histories of American literature. Roosevelt was as distinctly a man of letters as he was a man of action. He made himself known to the public, first of all, as the historian of the American Navy in the War of 1812. He followed this up with the 4 strenuously documented volumes of his Winning of the West, and amid all the multiplied activities of his later years, he made leisure for the appreciation of one or another of the books he had found to his taste. 2. It must be admitted that in the decade which elapsed after he left the White House, his intense interest in public affairs led him to devote a large part of his energy to the consideration of the pressing problems of the hour, to topics of immediate importance, to themes of only an ephemeral value, sufficient unto the day. In 3 or 4 different periodicals he served as contributing editor. In other words, he was a writer of signed editorials, in which he was always free to express his own views frankly and fully without undue regard for that mysterious entity, the policy of the paper. These contemporary contributions to dailies and weeklies and monthlies are journalism rather than literature, and the more completely they fulfill the purpose of the moment, the less do they demand preservation. Now and again they have the over-emphatic repetitions which are more or less justified by the conditions of journalism. But in these same 10 years Roosevelt wrote also his 2 books of travel in Africa and in South America, as vivacious as they are conscientious, his alluring and self-revelatory autobiography, his 2 volumes of essays and addresses, History as Literature, and A Book Lover's Holidays in the Open, both of them pungent with his individuality. It is not always, in fact it is not often, that the accomplished man of letters has the essential equipment of the journalist. He is likely to be more or less academic, and to lack the simplicity, the singleness of purpose, the directness of statement demanded in the discussion of the events of the moment. The editorial stands in the same relation to literature that the stump speech does to the stately oration. The editorial, like the stump speech, aims at immediate effect, and it is privileged to be more emphatic than might be becoming in a more permanent effort. It was perhaps Roosevelt's wide experience in addressing the public from the platform which made it easier for him to qualify as a contributing editor and to master the method of the newspaper. In his state papers and in his messages he had already proved that he had the gift of the winged phrase, keenly pointed and barbed to flesh itself in the memory. He had preached the doctrine of the strenuous life, and he had expounded the policy of the square deal. He had denounced some men as undesirable citizens, and others as malefactors of large wealth. And when he took up the task of journalism, he was happily inspired to the minting of other memorable phrases. There was, for example, an unforgettable felicity in his characterization of the weasel words that sometimes sucked the life out of a phrase, seemingly strong and bold. Never did he use smooth and sleek rhetoric to disguise vagueness of thought. In the periodical, as on the platform, he spoke out of the fullness of his heart, after his mind had clarified his emotion so that it poured forth with crystalline lucidity. There was no mistaking the full intent of his own words. He knew what he meant to say, and he knew how to say it with simple sincerity and with vigorous vivacity. His straightforwardness prevented his ever employing phrases that faced both ways and that provided rat holes from which he might crawl out. His style was tinglingly alive. It was masculine and vascular, and it was always the style of a gentleman and a scholar. He could puncture with a rapier and he could smash with a sledge-hammer, and if he used the latter more often than the former, it was because of his consuming hatred of things unmanly, ignominious, infamous. Journalism was young indeed, one might say that it was still waiting to be born, when Franklin put forth his pamphlets appealing to the scattered colonies to get together and to make common cause against the French, who had let loose the Indians to harry our borders. Franklin was cannily persuasive, making use of no drum-like words, empty, loud-sounding, and monotonous. But there burnt in his pages the same pure fire of patriotism that lighted Roosevelt's more impassioned exhortations for us to arouse ourselves from lethargy, that we might do our full duty in the war which saved civilization from the barbarian. Where Franklin addressed himself to common sense, Roosevelt called upon the imagination. Perhaps Franklin, as is the tendency of a practical man, a little distrusted the imagination. But Roosevelt, as practical as Franklin, had imagination himself, and he knew that the American people also had it. It is by imagination, by the vision and the faculty divine, that now and again an occasional address, like Lincoln's at Gettysburg, or a contributed editorial like Roosevelt's on the Great Adventure, transcends its immediate and temporary purpose, and is lifted aloft up to the serener heights of pure literature. It is not without intention that the Great Adventure has been set by the side of the Gettysburg Address. They are akin, and there is in Roosevelt's paragraphs not a little of the poetic elevation and of the exalted dignity of phrase which combine to make the address a masterpiece of English prose. Consider the opening words of the Great Adventure, and take note of the concision, like that of a Greek inscription. Only those are fit to live who do not fear to die, and none are fit to die who have shrunk from the joy of life and the duty of life. Both life and death are parts of the same great adventure. Never yet was worthy adventure worthily carried through by the man who put his personal safety first. Never yet was a country worth living in unless its sons and daughters were of that stern stuff which bade them die for it at need. And never yet was a country worth dying for unless its sons and daughters thought of life as something not concerned only with the selfish evanescence of the individual, but as a link in the great chain of creation and causation, so that each person is seen in his true relations as an essential part of the whole, whose life must be made to serve the larger and continuing life of the whole. Consider also these words a little later in the same article. If the only son who is killed at the front has no brother because his parents coldly dreaded to play their part in the great adventure of life, then our sorrow is not for them, but solely for the son who himself dared the great adventure of death. If, however, he is the only son because of the unseen powers denied others to the love of his father and mother, then we mourn doubly with them, because their darling went up to the sword of Azrael, because he drank the dark drink proffered by the death angel. 3. Roosevelt's style is firm and forthright, and its excellence is due to his having learnt the lesson of the masters of English. He wrote well because he had read widely and deeply, because he had absorbed good literature for the sheer delight he took in it. Consciously or unconsciously he enriched his vocabulary, accumulating a store of strong words which he made flexible, bending them to do his bidding. But he was never bookish in his diction. He never went in quest of recondite vocables, partly because his taste was refined, but chiefly because he was ever seeking to be understanded of the people. Like Lord Morley, he had little of the verbal curiosity contemned by Milton as toilsome vanity, and he was ready with Montaigne to laugh at fools who will go a quarter of a league to run after a fine word. To him life was more important than literature, and what he was forever seeking to put into his literature was life itself. He was a nature lover, but what he loved best was human nature. Yet his relish for life was scarcely keener than his relish for literature. We may think of him as preeminently an outdoors man, and such he was, of course. But he was also an indoors man, a denizen of the library as he was an explorer of the forest. Indoors and out he was forever reading, and he could not venture into the wilds of Africa in search of big game without taking along with him the volumes of the Pigskin Library, which testified at once to the persistence and to the diversity of his tastes as a reader. He devoured books voraciously, all sorts of books, old and new, established classics and evanescent bestsellers, history and fiction, poetry and criticism, travels on land and voyages by sea. To use an apt phrase of Dr. Holmes, he was at home with books as a stable boy is with horses. He might have echoed Lowell's declaration that he was a book man. The title of one of his later collections of essays is revelatory of his attitude toward himself, A Book Lover's Holidays in the Open. For even when he went into the open he wanted to have a book within reach. Of course he enjoyed certain books and certain kinds of books better than others. Of all Shakespeare's tragedies he best liked the martial Macbeth, preferring it to the more introspective Hamlet. He was not unlike the lad who was laid up and whose mother proposed to read the Bible to him, whereupon he asked her to pick out the fightingest parts. He had a special regard for the masculine writers, for Malory, more particularly, holding the Morte d'Arthur to be a better piece of work than the more delicately decorated Idylls of the King, which Tennyson made out of it. In fact, Roosevelt once went so far as to dismiss Tennyson's elaborate transpositions as tales of blameless curates clad in tin mail. He enjoyed writing as much as he did reading, and as a result his works go far to fill a 5-foot shelf of their own. When the man of action that he was had been out in search of new experiences and in the hunt for new knowledge, the man of letters that he was also impelled him to lose no time in setting down the story of his wanderings that others might share in the pleasure of his adventure without undergoing its perils. Being a normal human being, he liked to celebrate himself and to be his own Boswell, but he was never vain or conceited in his record of his own sayings and doings. He had the saving sense of humor, delighting in nothing more than to tell a tale against himself. He was not self-conscious nor thick-skinned, and he laughed as heartily as anyone when Mr. Dooley pretended to mistake the title of his account of the work of the Rough Riders, calling it Alone in Cubia. Perhaps it was because he was so abundantly gifted with the sense of humor that he had a shrewd insight into character, and that he could depict it incisively by the aid of a single significant anecdote. In sketching the many strange creatures with whom he was associated in the Far West, in South America, and in Africa, he showed that he had the Kodak eye of the born reporter. So it is that he gave us the 2 delightful volumes for which he drew upon his experiences as a rancher in the West, the stirring book devoted to the deeds of his dearly beloved Rough Riders, My Regiment, and the solid tomes in which he set down the story of his trips as a faunal naturalist in Africa and in South America. They are all books pulsing with life, vibrating with vitality, and they are all books unfailingly interesting to the reader because whatever is narrated in them has been unfailingly interesting to the writer. Walter Bagehot once suggested that the reason why there are so few really good books out of all the immense multitude which pour forth from the press is that the men who have seen things and done things cannot write, whereas the men who can write have not done anything or seen anything. Roosevelt's adventure books are really good, because after having seen many things and done many things, he could write about them so vividly and so sharply as to make his readers see them. Perhaps the autobiography ought to be classed with the earlier adventure books, since they were also autobiographic. It is a candid book. It puts before us the man himself as reflected in his own mirror. But it is not complete, since it was composed not in the retrospective serenity of old age, but while the autobiographer was in the thick of the fight, compelled to silence about many of the events of his career which we should like to see elucidated. It was published serially month by month, and perhaps because of the pressure under which it was undertaken, it seems to have a vague air of improvisation, as though it had not been as solidly thought out and as cautiously written out as one or another of the earlier books, the hunting trips of a ranchman, for example, or the Rough Riders. But it abides as a human document, and it explains why the autobiographer's buoyant personality appealed so intimately to the American people. 4. A Book Lover's Holidays in the Open contains 2 characteristic essays, both of them delightful in their zest and in their individuality. One is on Books for Holidays in the Open, and the other is about the author's Wild Hunting Companions, a searching and sympathetic appreciation of the human types developed by the wild life of the lessening wild places still uninvaded by advancing civilization. In History as Literature and Other Essays, there are other papers as characteristic and as attractive. 3 of them are the addresses which he delivered, on his triumphant return from his African journeys, at the Universities of Oxford and Berlin, and at the Sorbonne in Paris. They represent the high-water mark of his work as a constructive thinker. They are the lofty and dignified utterances of a statesman who was a practical politician of immense experience in the conduct of public affairs, and who was also a man of letters ambitious to present worthily the results of his experience and of his meditation. These disquisitions on themes seemingly so remote from his special fields of activity as the biological analogies of history, for example, have been called daring, and in fact they are daring. But they justify themselves, since they disclose Roosevelt's possession of the assimilated information and the interpreting imagination which could survey the whole field of history, past and present, using the present to illuminate the past and the past as a beacon to the present, and calling upon natural history to shed light upon the evolution of human history. These addresses are representative of Roosevelt when he chose to indulge himself in historic speculation. And in the same volume there is an essay, less ambitious but highly individual in theme and in treatment, and quite as characteristic as its stately companions. This is the discussion at once scholarly and playful of Dante in the Bowery, a paper which could have been written only by a lover of lofty poetry who had been a practical politician in New York. To Roosevelt, Dante's mighty vision is not a frigid classic demanding formal lip service, but a living poem with a voice as warm as if it had been born only yesterday. To him the figures who pass along Dante's pages are not graven images, tagged with explanatory footnotes. They are human beings, like unto us, the men of today and of New York. Thus it is that Roosevelt is led to dwell on the unaffectedness with which Dante dares to be of his own town and of his own time, and the simplicity with which Dante, wishing to assail those guilty of crimes of violence, mentions in one stanza Attila, and in the next 2 local highwaymen, by no means as important as Jesse James and Billy the Kid, less formidable as fighting men, and with adventure less startling and less varied. Roosevelt called attention to the fact that, of all the poets of the 19th century, Walt Whitman was the only one who dared to use the Bowery, that is, use anything that was striking and vividly typical of the humanity around him, as Dante used the ordinary humanity of his day. And even Whitman was not quite natural in doing so, for he always felt that he was defying conventions and prejudices of his neighbors, and his self-consciousness made him a little defiant. Roosevelt asked why it is that to us moderns in the 20th century it should seem improper and even ludicrous to illustrate human nature by examples chosen alike from Castle Garden and the Piraeus, from Tammany and the Roman mob organized by the foes or friends of Caesar. To Dante, such feeling itself would have been inexplicable. 5. Varied and brilliant as were Roosevelt's contributions to other departments of literature, it is more than probable that his ultimate reputation as a man of letters will most securely rest upon his stern labors as a historian, not on the brisk and lively little book on New York which he contributed to Freeman's Historic Towns series, not on the biographies of Benton and Gouverneur Morris which he wrote for the American Statesman series, not on the shrewd and sympathetic life of Cromwell, not on the stirring and picturesque hero tales of American history, which he prepared in collaboration with Henry Cabot Lodge, but on the 4 stately volumes of his most energetic and ambitious undertaking, the story of the Winning of the West, which he began in his early manhood and which he was always hoping to carry further. Macaulay once praised the work of one of his contemporaries because it exhibited the most valuable qualities of the historian: perspicuousness, conciseness, great diligence in examining authorities, great judgment in weighing testimony, and great impartiality in estimating characters. And no competent reader of the Winning of the West could fail to find all these qualities in its pages. A later historian, Professor Morse Stephens, set up 4 tests for the valuation of historical writing. First, the modern historian must have conscientiously mastered all the documents relating to his period at first hand. Secondly, he must appreciate all accessible primary material, with careful weighing of evidence and trained faculty of judgment. Thirdly, he must possess absolute impartiality, in intention as well as in act. And fourthly, he must also possess the one necessary feature of literary style in a history, clearness of statement. And the Winning of the West can withstand the application of all 4 of these tests. In other words, it is scientific in the collection and comparison and analysis of the accessible facts, and it is artistic in its presentation to the reader of the results of the writer's indefatigable research. As the Winning of the West was written by Roosevelt, it could not help being readable. Every chapter and every page is alive and alert with his own forceful and enthusiastic personality. This readability is not attained by any facile eloquence or any glitter of rhetoric, although it has passages, and not a few of them, which linger in the memory because of their felicitous phrasing. The book is abidingly readable because it is the result of deliberate literary art employed to present honestly the result of honest scientific inquiry. This is his sterling virtue as a historian, fittingly acknowledged by his fellow workers in this field when they elected him to the presidency of the American Historical Association. In an evaluation of the final volumes of Parkman's fascinating record of the fateful struggle between the French and the English for the control of North America, an article written in 1892, while that great historian was still living, Roosevelt remarked that modern historians always lay great stress upon visiting the places where the events they described occurred, and he commented that although this is advisable, it is far less important than the acquisition of an intimate acquaintance with the people and the life described. Then he asserted that it is precisely this experience which Mr. Parkman has had, and which renders his work so especially valuable. He knows the Indian character and the character of the white frontiersman by personal observation as well as by books, neither knowledge by itself being of much value for a historian. In consequence, he writes with a clear and keen understanding of the conditions. Roosevelt himself had the clear and keen understanding of the conditions with which he credited Parkman, in whose footsteps he was following, since the Winning of the West may be called a continuation of France and England in North America. Like Parkman, Roosevelt was a severely trained scientific investigator, who was also a born storyteller. If the historian is only an investigator, the result is likely to be a justification of the old jibe which defined history as "an arid region abounding in dates," and if he is only a storyteller, his narrative will speedily disintegrate. The true historian, Roosevelt asserted in History as Literature, his presidential address to the American Historical Association, will bring the past before our eyes as if it were the present. He will make us see as living men the hard-faced archers of Agincourt, and the war-worn spearmen who followed Alexander down beyond the rim of the known world. We shall hear grate on the coast of Britain the keels of the Low Dutch sea thieves whose children's children were to inherit unknown continents. We shall see conquerors riding forth to victories that have changed the course of time. We shall see the terrible horsemen of Timur the Lame ride over the roof of the world. We shall hear the drums beat as the armies of Gustavus and Frederick and Napoleon drive forward to victory. We shall see the glory of triumphant violence and the revel of those who do wrong in high places, and the broken-hearted despair that lies beneath the glory and the revel. We shall also see the supreme righteousness of the wars for freedom and justice, and know that the men who fell in those wars made all mankind their debtors. 6. At the end of the foreword to A Book Lover's Holidays, there is a noble passage which calls for quotation here as an example of Roosevelt's command of nervous English, measured and cadence. It is proposed in proof of the assertion that the joy of living is his who has the heart to demand it. The beauty and charm of the wilderness are his for the asking, for the edges of the wilderness lie close beside the beaten roads of present travel. He can see the red splendor of desert sunsets, and the unearthly glory of the afterglow on the battlements of desolate mountains. In sapphire gulfs of ocean he can visit islets, above which the wings of myriads of seafowl make a kind of shifting cuneiform script in the air. He can ride along the brink of the stupendous cliff-walled canyon, where eagles soar below him and cougars make their lairs on the edges and harry the big-horn sheep. He can journey through the northern forests, the home of the giant moose, the forests of fragrant and murmuring life in summer, the iron-bound and melancholy forests of winter. Theodore Roosevelt had the heart to demand it, and the joy of living was his. 1919. End of chapter 14.